Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into what has got to be the ultimate rags to riches story. We're talking about how Abu Dhabi went from a barren, completely sun-scorched island to, well, a staggering global powerhouse. But this isn't just your standard story about finding oil. No, it's actually an incredible masterclass in the art of survival. It's literally a playbook in pragmatism that, honestly, any modern leader could learn a thing or two from. $1.5 trillion. Just let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering size of the financial safety net managed by the ruling Al Nahyan family today. Basically, they've created this massive sovereign wealth cushion that practically guarantees the nation will never, ever be poor again. But it really makes you wonder, how exactly did a group of nomadic tribes, literally just fighting to survive in the harsh desert, manage to build what is essentially a hedge fund with a skyline? Let's find out. Okay, let's look at our structural roadmap for today. We'll start with an empire built on sand, then move into breaking the cycle of blood. After that, surviving the economic collapses, forging a fragile union, weathering global financial storms, and finally, the pragmatic path forward. Let's jump right into part 1, an empire built on sand. So our story kicks off back in the 18th century, right in the middle of this endless sea of sand called the Empty Quarter. And if you've never heard of it, this is genuinely one of the harshest environments on Earth. It's a place where fresh water is literally way more precious than gold, and soaring temperatures can, quite frankly, kill a man in a matter of hours. But legend has it that in 1761, a single lone gazelle led the nomadic Bani Yash tribe across some shallow waters to a totally barren island. And right there, defying basically every law of the desert, they found fresh water. They quickly named this island Father of the Gazelle, which in Arabic translates to Abu Dhabi. That little mud fortress they built around the well, that became the beating heart of their brand new coastal stronghold. Fast forward a bit, though, and a growing empire desperately needs protection. Under their visionary ruler, Zayed the Great, the emirate made a really massive survival compromise in 1892. They actually traded away their foreign policy freedom to the British Empire. And why? In exchange for total, absolute security against rival empires. It was a purely pragmatic calculation. They knew that alone, they were just prey. But allied with the greatest naval power on the planet at the time, well, they became totally untouchable. Moving on to part 2, breaking the cycle of blood. Now, while external enemies were kept nicely at bay by the British, the true existential threat was actually brewing inside their own walls. The early 20th century was a total, absolute instability. After Zayed the Great died in 1909, the transfers of power were just incredibly brutal. Because there was no fixed law of succession, the ruling family descended into this vicious cycle of brother against brother assassinations, all just to claim a rapidly dwindling treasury. I mean, Hamdan was murdered in his sleep, Sultan was shot right at a dinner table by his own brother Sakr, and then Sakr himself was later dragged out into the sand and executed. It was an absolute disaster. This relentless, bloody fratricide only came to an end when a very powerful matriarch named Salama finally stepped in. Having literally watched her husband get murdered and seeing her family tear itself apart, she gathered her surviving sons together in 1928. She made them swear on the Quran that no brother would ever again raise his hand against another. She basically used sheer moral force to save the dynasty from completely erasing itself from history. It was a massive pivotal moment for their internal survival. Which brings us to part 3, surviving the economic collapses. So, with the internal bleeding finally stopped, Abu Dhabi immediately faced a brand new, terrifying threat: sudden and total economic ruin. See, for centuries, natural pearls were the desert's only real source of wealth. Divers would literally risk their lives, plunging 40 feet down, holding their breath just to bring up oysters. But then, in the 1920s, a Japanese scientist named Kokichi Mikimoto invented cultured pearls. And suddenly, almost overnight, the global market was absolutely flooded with millions of cheap, flawless pearls. The Abu Dhabi economy completely collapsed. The pearling fleets just sat there rotting on the beaches, families were starving, and the treasury practically dropped to zero. You can imagine how this deep trauma of sudden poverty affected the ruling family. Decades later, when oil was finally discovered and exported in 1962, the ruler at the time, Sheikh Zayed, actually hoarded the money in iron chests. He was terrified, understandably maybe, that the wealth would just vanish again, exactly like the pearls did. But as we know, surviving in the modern world requires growth. This huge disagreement over strategy led to a bloodless coup in 1966 by his brother, Sheikh Zayed. Zayed firmly believed that true survival meant actively distributing wealth and aggressively building a modern state. You know, roads, schools, hospitals, the whole shebang. It's a classic lesson, really. You can't just save your way to survival. Sometimes you have to invest your way out.
All right, let's head into part 4, Forging a Fragile Union.
Just as Sheikh Zayed started modernizing the economy, their geopolitical safety net was completely ripped out from under them. In 1968, the British Prime Minister dropped a bombshell. He announced that Britain was broke and would be withdrawing all its forces from the Gulf by the end of 1971. Just like that, a 150-year-old umbrella of protection was gone. Abu Dhabi was left totally exposed. Without a central army of their own, they were incredibly vulnerable to Saudi expansionism and Iranian territorial ambitions. So, to avoid being swallowed whole by their neighbors, Sheikh Zayed pulled off 3 absolute masterstrokes. First, he held a highly secret meeting in 1968 with his rival in Dubai, basically agreeing that teaming up was way better than being conquered. Second, in 1971, he formed the United Arab Emirates, and he smartly poured Abu Dhabi's new oil money into the poorer Emirates to guarantee their absolute loyalty to this new union. And third, the 1974 Jeddah Treaty. Here, Zayed pragmatically traded a really rich oil field to Saudi Arabia in exchange for permanent border peace and recognition. He literally traded oil for survival. But here's the brilliant part. This wasn't just about throwing money into a savings account. This was institutionalized survival. In 1976, Sheikh Zayed created the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. He took the surplus oil revenue and built this massive global investment portfolio. The whole point was explicitly not for the glory of today, but to build a massive cushion for the young nation to protect it against whatever future shocks might come its way. And that brings us perfectly to part 5, weathering global financial storms. Let me tell you, that financial cushion was desperately needed because the late 20th century brought a relentless string of economic disasters. Look at how they systematically absorbed massive hits. In 1986, oil prices absolutely plunged, wiping out about 70% of their revenues. But Abu Dhabi, they survived by leaning right on that sovereign wealth cushion. Then in 1991, they lost up to $10 billion in the BCCI bank collapse, which was this massive, crazy global fraud. They just absorbed the hit and settled the debts. And then came 2008, the infamous global credit freeze that brought their glitzy neighbor Dubai completely to its knees. When Dubai was standing right on the brink of default in 2009, we're talking construction cranes literally frozen midair and debt spiraling totally out of control, Abu Dhabi stepped in decisively. They injected a massive $10 billion lifeline to save the Federation's reputation and prevent a total collapse. And in profound gratitude for this monumental bailout, Dubai actually renamed its glittering centerpiece, the tallest tower in the entire world, the Burj Khalifa, right after the ruler of Abu Dhabi. Let's wrap things up with part 6, the pragmatic path forward. Having survived brother against brother, total economic ruin, and scary geopolitical isolation, Abu Dhabi has charted a very clear, calculated path for its modern survival. Today, under the leadership of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, survival takes on a whole new shape. They are actively pivoting away from being completely dependent on oil. Instead, they're heavily diversifying into renewable energy, aerospace, and tourism, actually growing the non-oil economy by nearly 7% annually. They're also building a highly advanced regional military. And, in a major geopolitical shift, they signed the 2020 Abraham Accords, establishing diplomatic ties with Israel to counter shared regional threats. Honestly, it just goes to prove that for them, pragmatic survival is always going to trump pure ideology. So, as we finish up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought. Abu Dhabi has achieved something genuinely incredible, right? They transformed from a starving pearling fleet into a trillion-dollar futuristic powerhouse by adapting to literally every single threat thrown their way. But the story isn't over. How will this desert empire adapt and survive when the oil reserves finally run completely dry? Thank you so much for joining us, and keep questioning the mechanics of how the world really works.